white and black, were eagerly securing homes. Over 300 certificates of purchases have been issued. It was said that the legislative session was unduly prolonged, that unnecessary clerks were employed, that a liquor saloon was maintained, and that under the head of supplies, all sorts of personal things were furnished individual members of the legislature and charged to the state. But it is not, they utilize tax. Jesus. It's not like what Trump does when he goes fucking golfing and shit. But it is not usually added that merchants got the contracts for these furnishings. Some northerners, some southerners, they furnished the money to bribe committees and members of the legislature in order to secure for themselves the right to charge taxpayers outrageous prices for shoddy materials. They were doing more in this case than businessmen in New York and Philadelphia. But also, it is perfectly clear that they were doing no less. The state got a capital deck out in the flamboyant taste of the day. But we must not forget that for the first time in their drab life, representatives of black and white labor toiled in the fields and swamps and living in the unpaved slum of the towns, saw something that meant to them beauty and luxury, saw it and touched it and own it. And somehow I have more respect for the gold spittoons of freed black lawmakers in 1872 than for the caste elegance of the colonial mansions of slave drivers in 1860. Graft and bribery spread in the state, but the worst feature of corruptions in South Carolina is that members of both parties and men of all classes are involved in it, and that public adherence of corruption, which is the safeguard of popular government, seems wanting and dormant. Even the old aristocratic class, to whom we had been taught to attribute sentiments of chivalric, like chivalry, but chivalric honor, have not scrupled to bribe officials. Dr. R.M. Smith of Stanberg County, an old citizen of the Democratic member of the legislature, testified that he could see no wrong in bribing a public officer, and compared the transaction to the purchase of a mule in the taxpayers convention held in Columbia, South Carolina. Mr. F.F. Worley, a Darlington County, an old citizen of high standing, spoke as follows. As I said on yesterday, public fraud would not exist were it not for private individuals who act the part of corruptors. Where none of these engage in bribing members of the legislature, we would hear nothing of such fraud as the one I have endeavored to expose. Mr. President, one of my prominent features in this transaction is the part which native Carolinians have played in it, and it is to this feature that I ask to be allowed to address myself in closing. I say, sir, and I say it in sorrow, that some of our own household men who the state in the past have delighted to honor, but whose honors have been withered by the atmosphere of corruption that they breathe, are involved in this swindle. This legislature, composed chiefly of our former slaves, have been bribed by these men to do what? To give them the privilege by law of plundering the property holders of the state, now almost bankrupt by reasons of the burden of taxation under which they labor. It is difficult for citizens of other states to realize such prevalent corruption, affecting all classes of society, bringing to the same level patriots and rebel, black and white, the old citizens and the new. probably one cause contributing to produce this results is the condition of civil war, which has prevailed in the state, in which the power has been almost exclusively in the hands of one class and the property in the hands of another, while open hostilities have not generally and continually exist. Here has been mutual enmity, more better than usually accompanies flagrant welfare. Hence, some of the men in office may have regarded what was taken from the treasury as taken from the property holders, enemies of the government, and therefore spoils of war. And on the other hand, some property holders have come to consider that what they procure by bribery and corruption as a right of which they are wrongfully deprived, in which they are justified in recovering, and by any means. Another cause seems to be the contempt which the old property holding class manifest and feel for freemen and all who cooperate with them politically. This gives to bribery of such persons in the eyes of the old native class and semblance of the purchase of a slave. Many other Southerners, white speakers of the day, were clear and frank in assessing blame. C.W. Dudley said in 1871, hold on a second. Not right now because I'm not getting a lot of coins. In 1871, the people of color population must give us their assistance in any reforms which are contemplated. This they will do just as soon as they discover that their former owners are completely reconciled and to their new condition. If they have turned from us heretofore from a suspicion that their newly acquired rights had been grudgingly granted and were not safe in the hands of those who had never recognized them as equals, this is but natural, and we are compelled to admit that under similar circumstances we have done so ourselves. They have looked for protections to others because they are afraid to trust their all to those who might have a motive to betray that trust. Major F.F. Warley said the same year. If Dooley's in here, they mentioned you. Just kidding. Dooley's not in here. I scorn the idea that the rich man in his glory and the mighty man in his power may indulge in crime with punity and be passed by the world with a smile of recognition, while the poor tool he uses is consigned to prison and made the association of felons. If I have displayed zeal and ardor in this exposure of fraud and vice, it is because I would save the state, not from arrogant, ignorant, or corrupt legislators, so much as for rich, aspiring, and unprincipled men. Some of them imported, it is true, but many of them degenerate and unworthy sons of that noble, though now impoverished, mother whom they robbed. There was then, without doubt, theft and incompetence in the government of South Carolina during the Reconstruction time. But there is a good ground for saying that this was no more due to Northern white men than to native Southerners. I hate when they use native Southerners. Still, yeah. And least of all was it the guilt of black people. Moreover, in the method and amount, it was no worse than the same kind of stealing in northern states, and even in the United States government itself. If we will allow for deprecated currency and for the monies which the state did not actually receive and did not spend, but for which it may have been legally illegally responsible. North Carolina doubled its debt between 1865 and 1871, but it more than doubled its social responsibilities. That the process of debt thus accumulated were not spent wholly to meet these social demands. It's undoubtedly true, but it is also true that every cent which South Carolina raised in Reconstruction times and much more was needed for the uplift of its laboring classes. It is interesting to note that $17,500,000 of the South Carolina debt, or almost the exact amount of its probable increase over 1865, was eventually repudiated by the state, and the property of the state thus put itself on the record as refusing to recognize its obligation to pay the expense, even the necessary reconstruction, and at that same time, it had the satisfaction of spoiling the Egyptians and the northern money market. Two sorts of reform faced the state. First, the elimination of theft and waste in the handling of public funds, and secondly, the continuation of the efforts of social uplift and land distribution, institutions for social reforms, educational equipment, and modern labor legislation. With the last category, the reformers would have nothing to do. What they meant by reforms was lower taxes, and this Chamberlain gave them. It is easy to prove that this part of the effort to reform the situation in South Carolina had the earnest effort of both white men and black men. That resulted in distinctive events, and it was overthrown at just the time when there was very reasons to think that reform would be triumphed. Now, not simply in honest government, but in more efficient social uplift. No one has expressed this more convincingly than a black person who was himself a member of the Reconstruction legislature of South Carolina and spoke at the convention which disenfranchised him in 1895 against one of the onslaughts of Tillman. The gentleman of Edgefield, Mr. Tillman, speaks of a piling up of the state debt, of jobbery and peculation? I don't know this word. Peculation? Let me look at this word real quick. I have to be reminded of it. Oh, come on. Why won't it let me say it? Hold on. Going to another dictionary.
Peculation.
Peculation. Okay. Which means the fraudulent appropriation or embezzlement of public funds or property entrusted to one's care, typically by a public official or personal use. So, peculation during the period between 1869 and 1873 in South Carolina. But he has not found voice eloquent enough, nor pen exact enough to mention those imperishable gifts bestowed upon South Carolina between 1873 and 1876 by black legislators. The law relative to finance, the building of penal and charitable institutions, and greatest of all, the establishment of public school system, started as infants of legislation in 1869. Many wise measures were not thought of. Many injudicial acts were passed. But in the administration of affairs for the next 4 years, having learned by experience the result of bad acts, we immediately passed reformatory laws touching every department of state, country, county, municipal, and town governments. These enactments are today upon the status books in South Carolina. They stand as living witnesses of the black people's fittest to vote and legislate upon the rights of mankind. When we came into power, town governments could lend the credit of their respective towns to secure funds at any rate of the interest that the council saw fit to pay. Some of the towns paid as high as 20%. We passed an act prohibiting town governments from pledging the credit of their helmets for money bearing a greater rate of interest than 5%. Up to 1874 exclusive, the state treasurers had the power to pay out state funds as he pleased. He could elect whether he could pay out the funds on appropriation that would place the money in the hands of the speculators, or would apply them to appropriation that were honest and necessary. We saw the evils of this and passed on an act making specific levies and collections on taxes for specific appropriations. Another source of proof legacy. I'm gonna look up this word again. I don't know if I've said it right. I'm trying to. Hey, Dooley, you were mentioned in this book. You're a white Southerner, but you're mentioned in the book. Just kidding. It's funny. Sorry. You had to be here. FLIG. Okay, there it is. I think that's it. Come on. Profligacy. Reckless, extravagance, wasteful, spending money / resources for shameless, moral, unsolutness. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. In the expenditures of funds was the law that provided for the empowerment, the levying and collecting of special taxes by school districts in the name of the school. We saw its evil, and by a constitutional amendment provided that there should only be a levied and collected annually a tax of 2 mills. Yeah, I think it's maybe 2 million. I'm not sure. For school purposes, and took away from the school district the power to levy and to collect taxes of any kind. We cured the evils that had been inflicted upon us. In the name of the schools, settled the public school question for all time to come, and established a system upon the honest financial basis. Next, we learned during the period of 1869, from 1869 to 1874, exclusive, that was dominated the floating indebtedness, covered the printing schemes and other indefinite expenditures amounting to nearly $2 million. A conference was called of the leading black representatives in the two houses together with the state treasurer. Also a black person. After this conference, we passed an act for the purpose of ascertaining the bona fide floating debt, and found that it did not amount to more than $250,000 for the 4 years. We created a commission to sift the indebtedness and to scale it. Hence, when the Democratic Party came into power, they found the floating debt covering the legislative and all other expenditures fixed at a certain sum of $250,000. This same class of black legislators, led by the state treasurer, Mr. F.L. Cardozo, known that there were millions of fraudulent bonds charged against the credit of the state, passed another act to ascertain the true bonded indebtedness and to provide for its settlement under this law at one sweep. Those entrusted with the power to do so through black legislators stamped 6 million of bonds, dominated as conversion bonds, fraudulent, quote unquote. The commission did not finish its work. there were still to be examined into the settled under the terms of the act passed by us, providing for the legitimate bonded indebtedness of the state a little over $2.5 million worth of bonds and coupons which had not been passed upon. Governor Hampton, General Hagood, Judge Simpson, Judge Wallace, and in fact all the conservative thinking Democrats all aligned themselves under the provision enacted by us for the certain and final settlement of the bonded indebtedness, and applied to their Democratic legislator to stand by the Republican legislation on the subject and to confirm to it a faction in the Democratic Party obtained a majority of the Democrats in the legislature against settling the question. They endeavored to open up anew the whole subject of the state debt. This is still the same dude talking. He had a little over 30 members in the House and enough Republican senators to sustain the Hampton conservative faction and to stand up for the honest finance. And by our vote, place the debt question of the old state into the hands of the plunderers and the speculators. We were appealed to by General Hagood through me, and my answer to him was in these words, quote, General, our people have learned the differences between pro-instance of God. When the vote shall have been taken, you will be able to record for the 30-odd black people slandered though they have been through the press, and they have voted solidly with you on all for the honest legislation and the preservation of the credit of the state. End quote. The 30-odd black people in the legislators and their senators, by their votes, did settle the debt question and save the state $13 million. We are 8 years in power. We had built schoolhouses, established charitable institutions, built and maintained penitentiary systems, provided for education for the deaf and not able to talk vocal people, rebuilt the jails and courthouses, rebuilt the bridges, and reestablished the farriers. In short, we had reconstructed the state and placed it upon the road of prosperity, and at the same time, by our acts of financial reform, transmitted it to Hampton government in indebtedness not greater by more than $500,000. Then was the bonded debt of the state in 1868 before Republican black people and their white allies came into power. That was a long speech. It seems fairly clear that what South Carolina wanted was not reform, even in its narrow sense. That what it was attacking was not even stealing the corruption. If there was one thing that South Carolina feared more than bad black government and its own good black government, I don't know, I'm not using the N-word, sorry everybody, and find dishonesty in South Carolina not as racial. It was not even a matter of the lower economic classes, white or black. It was the child of an age of extravagance and characteristics of a state where the mass of the voters were poverty-stricken and the property holders angry and ruthless in their methods. Someone saying this. In fact, that the best men of the South, unlike the abolitionists of John Brown's time, were unwilling to strike openly and trust that the end of the future would justify the means, is very good evidence that the method by which black rule was overthrown had not as yet been proved to be necessary, and therefore were unjustifiable. Goodwin Smith was said that statesmanship is an art of avoiding revolution. of the Democrats of Mississippi and South Carolina in 1875 and 1876. One might well say, quote, their revolution was the art of avoiding statesmanship. Beneath the race issue, and unconsciously of more fundamental weight, was the economic issue. Men were seeking again to reestablish the domination of property in the Southern politics by getting rid of black labor vote. By getting rid of the black labor vote, yeah. And they would take their first and substantial steps by raising the race issue. They would secure domination over the white labor vote, and thus the oligarchy that ruled the South before the war would be in part restored to power. It would, of course, lack capital, but the North stood ready to furnish capital if profit could be obtained, and it was being made more and more clear that this furnishing of capital, far from being contingent upon universal suffrage in the South, could be made more available, even if black labor vote was disenfranchised completely, and white labor directed in the South by the same methods that they were dominating in the North. And here's a poem. I'm not good with poems, everybody. "'Tis not the high stars alone, nor in the cups of budding flowers, nor in the redbreast mellow tones, nor in the bow that smiles in the showers, but in the mud and scum of things, there always something sings." Ralph Wendell Emerson. And that's the end of that, everybody. No idea what that was. What was that? That was Doodley. All right. I think we're on chapter 11. Black proletariat in Mississippi and Louisiana. Oh, come up. How in two other states with black majorities, enfranchised labor led by educated men and groups of their own blood sought so to guide the state as to raise the worker to comfort and safety, and failed before land monopoly and new power of imported capital in organized force and fraud. Did you want to say something, Dooley? You just up here?
I'm up here for when the book is over to give my 2 cents.
Sounds good. Mississippi has been called a particular typical state in which to study Reconstruction, but this should be modified. In direct contrast to South Carolina, Mississippi was a place where the first and last black people were largely deprived of any opportunity of land ownership. The Great Black Belt plantation on the Mississippi had hardly been disturbed by war. The barons ruling there, who had dictated the policy of the state, were to the last degree reactionary because they entirely misconceived the result of the war. They were determined not to recognize even the abolition of slavery, and as for establishing peasant proprietors on their land or granting even civil rights, they were adamant to the proposition of political rights of black people. They simply would not listen for a moment. Mississippi was in all respects a curious state. It was the center of a commercialized cotton kingdom. The graciousness and ease of the plantation system had scarcely taken root there. Mississippi plantations were designed to raise a profitable cotton crop and not to entertain visitors. Here and there, the more pretentious slave matter flourished, but on the whole, the level of the state in civilization and culture was distinctly below that of Virginia and South Carolina, and smacked more in an undisciplined frontier. In the state, there were in 1860 353,899 white people and 437,404 black people, of whom less than 1,000 were free. Wow. The population had only been a few thousand at the beginning of the century and small in 1820. Then, in 1840, on the Cotton Kingdom spread over Mississippi, greatly increasing its population. The result was that after the war, there was in this state a group of planters whose great plantations dominated the rich Black Belt. From Mississippi to the Gulf, where the successions of counties, with 60% or more of Black population, while on the poor lands of the Northeast and Southeast were the poor whites. The planters had always dominated the state in its political and economic aspects, and it was suddenly required after the war that this state should not only assimilate a voting population of nearly 450,000 former slaves, but also that the mass of poor whites should have a political significance which they had never had before. It was projected that which Mississippi quelled. Sterling Price prayed, quote, "To God that my fears for the future of the South may be realized. But when the right is given to a Black person to bring suit testified before the courts and vote in elections, you all had better be in Mexico." Jesus. Mississippi had a bad financial reputation. Long before the Civil War, Reconstruction actually improved this. In 1839, less than 1/10 of the money collected from the fines and forfeitures by the sheriffs and clerks throughout the state had reached the Treasury. In 1840, the Senate Journal had the names of 26 tax collectors who were defaulters to the average amount of $1,000 each. In 1858, the auditors of the state was the defaulters for $54,000. The endowment of Jefferson College valued at $248,748, disappearing without record, and the college had to be closed. The money realized from the 16th section fund donated to the school by the Congress of the United States was lost or embezzled to the amount of $1,500,000. The Mississippi Union Bank sold bonds to the amount of $5 million and later repudiated the debt. The effect of war on property in the state was marked. The assessed valuation of Mississippi property in 1860 was over $500 million. Subtracting $218 million, also the value of the slaves, we have $291,472,912. This was reduced in 1870 to $177,278,890. The whole industrial system was upset, and the cotton crops, which was 1.2 million bales in 1860, was in 1870 only 565,000 bales. Naturally, these planter capitalists proposed to protect themselves from further losses by dominating the labor of their former slaves and getting their work as cheaply as possible with the least outlay of capital, and selling their crops at prevailing high prices. William L. Sharkey, former Chief Justice of the state, was appointed provisional governor May 15, 1865, and the state held a constitutional convention the same year, the first to be held in the South under the Johnson Plan. The governor complained that there was, quote, "an unprecedented amount of lawlessness in the state," end quote. The convention consists of 100 delegates, most of them representing former Whigs. Largely, Whigs was a branch of government, a party. Largely, I think, isn't Washington a Whig or some shit like that? I think.
I think maybe Whig means like someone who's snooty and high class.
No. There's actually
could be wrong.
there's actually a government, a political party called the Whigs, the Whig Party. I'm pretty sure. Let's find out. We're going to look. Was there a party in the United States called the Whig Party? Yes.
Yes, there was a Whig Party in the United States. It was a major political party that existed from 1834 to the mid-1850s. The Whigs opposed President Andrew Jackson and supported economic growth, high tariffs, and government funding for infrastructure.
They're anti-Jacksonians. Largely opposed to the secession of 1861. That mid-1850s, they say. This convention recognized slave. Maybe you're right. You could be right too. So we'll take on both categories. How about that? Just to be safe. This convention recognized slavery as abolished, but did not wish to assume responsibility. Quote, for whatever honor there may be in abolishing it, end quote. The ordinance, therefore, was passed, declaring that slavery had been abolished in the United States, and that hereafter it should not exist in the state. Further concessions of black people were fought, and black people of the state met October 7th, and the protests of Congress expressing fear lest they be re-enslaved. President Johnson wrote to the Governor Sharkey, suggesting that black people of education and property be given the right to vote so as to forestall the radicals of the North. Johnson pointed out that such a grant would completely disarm the adversary, the radical Republicans in Congress. The suggestion did not receive any attention whatever from the convention. It is highly probable that the unanimous sentiment of the convention was against the idea of political rights for black people in any form. But the whole arsenal of reason against enfranchisement was already prepared. Most of them started from the assumption of the general black franchise and consequent black domination. The intelligent freemen had considered but, quote, a drop in the bucket. It was argued that this is a white man's government, and that in the sight of God, the light of reason, a black suffrage was impossible. The real fight in the convention was on the subsidiary question as to whether black testimony would be allowed in court. And if it was on this question that the campaign for electing a governor and legislator turned. It was remarkable that throughout the South, far from envisaging black people's suffrage for the moment, the states fought first to see how few civil rights must be granted black people. And this gradually boiled down to the monumentous question as to whether a black person would be allowed to testify against a white man in court. The election took place October 2nd, 1865, and Humphreys, a general in the Confederate Army, was elected governor by the party opposed to letting black people testify in court, which also secured a majority of the members of the legislature. This defeat Sharkey's candidacy for the United States Senate. Humphreys had received no pardon from the president when elected but received one after. Sharkey notified the president that the governor and legislator had been elected by the president, made him retain his power, and warned him that the legislator must accept the 13th Amendment and the Code for the Protection of Black People. There was continued friction between the military and civil authorities. The president allowed the rights of habeas corpus to remain suspended. Anarchy must, in any case, be prevented, quote unquote. The presence of black troops in the state caused bitter complaint. On January 5th, 1866, there were 8,784 black troops and 333 black officers. The president promised to remove them as soon as possible. Sharkey declared that they encouraged the belief among black people that land were going to be distributed among them. By the 20th of May, 1866, all black troops had been mustered out and removed from Mississippi. The legislature then proceeded to adopt the celebrated Black Code of 1865. and completed the set of laws of reenacting all the penal and criminal laws applied to slaves, except so far as the mode of matter and the trial of punishment has been ordained by law, quote unquote. The North was incensed, and the Chicago Tribune said that the North would convert Mississippi into a frog pond before they will allow any such laws to touch 1 foot of soil in which the bones of our soldiers sleep. Back of this sediment was the conviction that Mississippi, whose political population for congressional appointment was 616,040 in 1860, and now by increasing to 900,000, and this new power was going to be arrayed against Northern industry, thrift, and power. The whole reactionary course of Mississippi helped the abolition democracy in the North. General Ord assumed command in Mississippi in March 1867, and on April 5th, he began to register the new electorates, people of color and white. Among Ord's appointees was Isaiah T. Montgomery, formerly a slave of Jefferson Davis. He was made a justice of the peace and was perhaps the first black person in the state to hold public office. Ord appointed a number of civil officials and was compelled practically to nullify the black code by military order. The result of the registration showed the white people that, contrary to their firm and happy belief that black people was not becoming extinct, 46,636 white voters registered and 60,137 black people. This showed the political situation plainly. In 1867, the cotton crop was almost a total failure on account of weather conditions and other reasons. Ord issued an order requiring investigation of charges against landholders of driving off freemen in order to prevent paying back wages. There was a great deal of theft of cotton and horses. Later, the abundant crop of 1868 induced Mississippi to begin to believe in free labor. At Christmas 1867, there had been widespread rumors of a black insurrection due to the idea that the land was going to be redistributed among them. Humphreys, then governor, issued a proclamation reciting the apprehension of combination or conspiracies formed among black people to seize the land unless Congress should arrange a plan to distribute by January 1st. Ord told General Gillem, commander of the sub-district of Mississippi, that Congress was not going to seize the land of planters, but that the governor had already plenty of land in Mississippi for freemen, and that they could settle on it when they chose to do so. The election was set for the first Tuesday in November 1867. Black people were given representation among election officials. This brought bitter protests. And I don't know if this is the bitter protest, but this is a thing. Hey, look, hello. We hope this shameful humiliation would be spared our people, at least until the freemen of Mississippi decide whether they will submit to black equality at the ballot box or elsewhere. General Ord has hitherto exhibited a wisdom in his administration, which has been highly approved by the people, but we doubt not the lovers of peace throughout the country will condemn the order as injudicious. It's not insulting to the race whom God has created superior to the black man, and whom no monarch can make his equal. The general commanding cannot surely have forgotten that the black person has no political rights conferred on him by the state of Mississippi, although he is given the privilege by a corrupt and fragmented Congress to cast the ballot in the coming farce, dignified by the name of election. That's the end of that. That was bad. White Mississippi fought Reconstruction tenaciously at every step. The legislators stubbornly refused to adopt the 13th Amendment, declared that they had already abolished slavery, and that they would not consent to the second action, which gave Congress the right to enforce freedom. Shall Mississippi ratify the 13th Amendment? Asked Vicksburg Herald on November 9th. We answer no, 10,000 times no. Assholes. Then came the question as to who might register and who was to decide on the eligibility of the former Confederate. The commanding general, in accordance with Johnson's instructions, declared that the Board of Registrar had no power. He was overruled by General Grant and by the Act of Congress of July 19th. Immediately, Mississippi tried to bring the matter before the Supreme Court by seeking to enjoin President Johnson from enforcing the Reconstruction Act. The Supreme Court refused to entertain the case on the ground that it would interfere with the coordinate branch of the government in the performance of its duties. Thereupon, another action was brought by the Senate of Georgia, which tried to enjoin the Secretary of War, but the court held that it was without jurisdiction. Finally, the celebrated case Ex parte McCardell was started on appeal from the military decision at Vicksburg, but Congress forestalled the case by depriving the court of jurisdictions in this particular case and others of similar character. There had been a plan for the white people to refrain from voting in 1867, a plan widespread through other southern states. The idea was that by refraining from taking any part in this convention, the whole thing might go by default and Reconstruction failed. But that seemed too much of a risk. And in its place, there came a movement on the part of some of the planters to acquiesce in the situation and to organize a plan the control of the black vote. In other words, certain leaders, like the editor of the Jackson Clarion, General Alcorn, and Judge Campbell, were in favor of recognizing the rights of black people to vote in 1868, and said that the policy of Democrats would drive black people into the Republican Party. Ex-Senator Brown agreed, and many other white leaders. The most advanced Reconstructionist was General Alcorn, who asked if it would not be wise to yield something to black suffrage, and then to control the votes in the interest of such an organization of industry and society as they thought best. This was not wild schema. Black people were used to subordination to the great planters. If the planters did not form an alliance with black people, the planters would be threatened by the pretensions of poor whites and possible leadership from northern white men, ex-soldiers and investors who were largely represented in the state. It was a matter to consider carefully. In the end, Mississippi went further along this line than any other southern state, and found it easier to do this because of the compulsion and intimidation that could be exercised over the black vote on the great plantations of the Black Belt. So they're going to try to control the vote. So they're going to go ahead and be like, yeah, we'll do it. But this. So, oh my God. So-called Black and Tan Convention met in Jackson, January 9th, 1868. It was the first political organization in Mississippi with people of color representatives. There were in all 100 delegates. Hold on, I got to do a picture. There were There were in all 100 delegates, of whom 17 were people of color, although 32 counties had black majority. There were 29 natives, white Republicans, and 20 or more Northern Republicans. This was interesting and characteristic. It showed, in the first place, that black people were not even trying, much less succeeding in any efforts to use their numerical preponderance in order to put themselves in political power. Under strong economic pressure, the black voter designated white men to represent him. The larger majority of the members of this convention were elected by black voters. Seven or eight of the delegates of color were ministers. 4 of the Northern Republicans had lived in the South before the war, and 2 had served in the Confederate Army. It characterizes the time to know that 5 of the members afterwards met violent deaths. Members were paid $10 a day in depreciated script worth 75 cents to 70 cents on the dollar, making their pay about equal to the convention of 1865. During the organization of the convention, it was moved that the word, I have to use it, the word colored, I had to use it, quote unquote, be added to the name of each black delegate. Thereupon, the Reverend James Lynch, a man of color, afterward Secretary of State, moved to amend it so that the color of each delegate's hair should be added also. There was here, as in South Carolina, the same charge against this convention and against succeeding legislators that they did not sufficiently represent wealth. They represented poverty, and the majority of the members, black and white, were not taxpayers. They represented labor and were voting and working as far as they intelligently could to improve their conditions and not to increase the profits of the hirers of labor. In the convention of people of color clung to the idea that government intended to divide the land among them. One of the first acts of the convention was to appoint a committee of 5 to report what legislation was needed to afford relief and protection to the state and its citizens. This committee reported earlier in February and found an alarming amount of destitution among the laboring class. They thought that the number of destitute was at least 30,000 and perhaps was 40,000. There was distress and suffering, which in some cases bordered an actual starvation. The commanding general, who was at the time Gilliman of Tennessee, sided with the planting interests, refused to cooperate with the convention in this matter, and declared that the demand for labor exceed the supply. In other words, labor must work for food or starve. It was reported that that black people were still expecting to the distribution of land, suspensions of taxes imposed upon freemen prior to January 1st, 1868, was demanded, and the repudiation of all debts, contracts, and judgments occurred or made prior to April 28th, 1865. The commanding general was requested to issue an order, quote, directing the restoration of property alleged to have been unlawfully taken from persons of color on the ground that property accumulated by them in the state of slavery belonged to their masters, end quote. This the general declined to do. The commanding general was again requested in the report signed by 3 members of color to furnish from the public funds means to return slaves sold into Mississippi to their former homes. And Congress was asked to set aside through the Freedmen's Bureau 1/2 of the cotton tax collected in the state. They asked the governor of the state to let black people share in the donations sent him for the relief of the destitute, but but the governor, oh my gosh, I got hair all over me. But the governor refused, saying that it was a private gift. After this preliminary discussion, which is afterward criticized as besides the point, in the fact it was the main point, the convention turned towards making a new constitution, as they had refused to adopt the old. They framed the constitution under which Mississippi lived for 22 years. It did away with property qualifications for office or for suffrage. It forbade slavery. It provided for a mixed public school system. It forbade race distinctions in the possession of inheritance of property. It prohibited the abridgment of civil rights in travel. And in general, it was a modern instrument based on universal suffrage. The minority tried to disenfranchise the mass of arrogant, ignorant black people, and there was considerable quarreling and some fighting. Universal suffrage was adopted by a large majority, and on the account of that, 12 of the white delegates resigned. Other ordinances forbade property qualification for office or educational qualification for suffrage. The civil government under Reconstruction increased their power of governor and made a more elaborate governmental organization and functioned for the state. It provided for a lieutenant governor, a state superintendent of education, and numerous other officials. Some of the counties were consolidated to form larger legislative districts. Evidently, the success of the planters in controlling the black vote alarmed the carpetbaggers and the poor whites, and they determined to suppress the ringleaders of the rebellion far more drastically than was required by the Reconstruction Act. The convention consequently determined to deny the rights to vote and hold office to practically all whites who had anything to do with the rebellion, and thus the proposed constitution disenfranchised perhaps 20,000 or more of the leading white citizens of the state. This has been represented. Now, these are the people that were part of the rebellion, they were part of the Confederate Army. So this has been represented as petty jealousy and desire for vengeance on the part of the baggers. It was more than this. It was an attempt to end the oligarchy of landlords who still advocated slavery and the rule of the wealth. After sitting 115 days, the convention adjourned and submitted the Constitution to the people. The proceedings of this convention had undoubtedly been dominated by the wishes of the northern men and the poor whites, with the support of black people. But instead of cementing the alliance, black people were ignored. And when preparations were made for the campaign, were given little recognition. The chief evidence of this was the failure to nominate black people for office. The real policy beneath this was ignoring the plight of black labor and making the Republican Party chiefly the mouthpiece of the new northern capital. The opposition, organized as the Democratic White Men's Party of Mississippi, and declared that the Republicans were trying to degrade the Caucasian race. Oh my gosh. The provision for a mixed school system particularly came in a widespread criticism. Meantime, Humphreys was removed as governor on the account of opposition to the Reconstruction Act, and General Adelbert Ames appointed acting governor. Humphreys refused to give up and was removed by soldiers, but reaction was not beaten. The vote of the Black Belt was cast largely under the dictation of the landholders and hirers of black labor. The result of the election was a surprise. 56,231 votes were cast for the Constitution. 63,860 were cast against it. and Humphreys had been reelected governor. A committee of 5 from the convention announced that the election had been carried by fraud and intimidation, accompanied by social proscriptions and threats to discharge laborers from employment. The Republicans held meetings in various counties declaring that the late election had been the work of terrorism and fraud. On the other hand, the result of the election was to show all parties that a more sincere attempt to recognize black people and enable him to vote had to be made. Black people could not be ignored. Their right to vote meant something. If they were intimidated and coerced by force and economic means, the planters would soon be back in power. Moreover, even in this election, certain leading black people like John R. Lynch had deliberately voted with the planters, and an alliance of planters and black people was not impossible. It would have been an alliance based partly on labor control and partly on understanding consummated between black labor leaders and white landholders. Working out from the old slavery, it might have gradually negotiated an industrial emancipation for the intelligent black people, while using the solid black vote to keep white labor and northern capital subordinate. One group of black people recommended, therefore, another constitutional convention. They said they wished to cultivate kindly relations with their white friends and declare that they would support capable and honorable men, even if they were former Confederates. The 40th Congress adjourned with the question of Mississippi's unsettled. Finally, in April 1869, a bill was agreed upon, which directed that Mississippi was to be omitted when she adopted the 15th Amendment, and that the president was authorized to submit the Constitution as a whole, and also the same Constitution with its provisions disenfranchising the bulk of Confederates left out. Gilman was removed, and General Ames, who had been acting civil governor, was made provisional governor of the state. He reported that certain men, backed by public opinion, were committing murder and outrages. Under the direction of Congress, Ames removes a large number of officers and made appointments of state and local officers, including several black people. Among other things, he declared freemen to be competent juniors. He said of his work at this time, "I found when I was military governor of Mississippi that a black code existed there, that black people had no rights, and that they were not permitted to exercise the rights of citizenship. I had given them the protection they were entitled to under the laws, and I believe I could render them great service. I felt that I had a mission to perform in the interest, and I hesitantly consented to represent them and unite my fortune with theirs." Ames thus made a counter bid for black support, reversing the indifferent stand of Mississippi Republicans. In July, President Grant issued a proclamation ordering the Constitution to be submitted for ratification. November 30th, the Radical Republicans held their convention July 2nd and attempted a platform of several resolutions. These resolutions declared in favor of the impartial and economic administration of the government, the restricted rights of speech to all men at all times and places, unrestrained freedom of the ballot, a system of free schools, a form of the iniquitous and unequaled, I gotta look at this word. Sorry, everybody. I'll make sure I got this right. Wrong phone. Hi. There it is.
Iniquitous.
Iniquitous and unequal. Systems of taxations and assessments which discriminate against labor, declaring that all men without regard of race, color, and previous conditions of servitude were equal before the law, recommending removal of political disabilities as soon as the quote spirit of the toleration now dawning upon the state should be so firmly established as to justify Congress in taking such action, declaring in favor of universal amnesty, universal suffrage, and encouragement of immigration. Ex-Governor Brown of the Conservatives were in favor to ratifying the Constitution without the proscriptive provisions and of attempting the 15th Amendment. They secured Judge Dent, a brother-in-law of Grant, as their candidate, thinking in that way to secure the goodwill of Grant. But Grant repudiated the party that nominated Dent. Then the Dent party nominated Thomas Sinclair, a man of color, for Secretary of State. The Republican nominee, General J.L. Acorn, for governor, and the Reverend James Lynch, a biracial preacher, for Secretary of State. Now around Mississippi's trying to keep the government white. The whole election showed the increased political importance of black people, and this undoubtedly explains the increased activity of the Triple K in 1869. There were some riots in 3 or 4 counties. The Constitution was ratified almost unanimously. Unanimous, I can't say the damn word. But the prospective sections disenfranchising members of the session, convention, and other active Confederates were defeated. The provision forbidding the loan of state funds was ratified. The first Reconstruction legislature met at Jackson, January 11th, 1870. The legislature elected in 1868 had never been convened because of the defeat of the Constitution. Black membership in the new legislature was larger in the convention. There were 40 members of color, some of whom had been slaves before the war. But among them were some, quote, very intelligent men. Particularly, there was considerable representation of ministers. In the Senate, there were 5 members of color. Many of the wealthiest countries were represented by ex-slaves. Yet, as Lynch shows, black people never controlled Mississippi. No man of color in that state ever occupied a judicial position above that of Justice of Peace, and very few aspired to that position. Of 7 state officers, only 1, that of the Secretary of State, was filled by a man of color. Until 1873, when men of color were elected to 3 or 7 offices: Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, and State Superintendent of Education. Of the 2 United States Senators and 7 members of the lower house of Congress, not more than 1 person of color, man, occupied a seat in each house at the same time. Of the 35 members of the state Senate, and of the 115 members of the House, which compose of a total membership of the state legislators prior to 1874, there were never more than about 7 men of color in the Senate and 40 in the lower house. Of the 97 members that composed of Constitutional Convention in 1868, but 17 were men of color. The composition of the lower house of the state legislature that was elected in 1871 was as follows. Total membership, 115 Republicans, 66 Democrats, 49 members of color, 38 white members, 77 white majority, 39 of the 66 Republicans, 38 were men of color, and 28 were white. There was a slight increase of members of color's membership. As a result of the election of 1873, But men of color never at any time had control of the state government, nor of any branch of department thereof, nor even that of any county or municipalities. Out of 72 counties in the state at that time, electing on an average of 81 officers to a county, it is safe to assert that not over 5 out of 100 of such officers were men of color. The state, district, county, and municipal governments were not only in control of white men, but white men who were in the manner born, or who were known as old citizens of the state, those who had lived in the state many years before the war of the rebellion. There was therefore never a time when that class of white men, known as carpetbaggers, had absolute control of state government, or that any district, county, or municipalities, or any branch of government thereof, there was never, therefore, any ground for the alleged apprehension of black domination as a result of a free, fair, and honest election in any one of the southern and Reconstruction states. So they tried their best to maintain it as white domination. And this is their state government, just to be sure. At the same time, black people were laborers. And if at any time the white and black labor vote united, property and privilege in Mississippi were bound to suffer. And on the other hand, if property controlled black labor, white labor would be as helpless as before the war. These two fears explain Reconstruction in Mississippi. The legislature ratified the 14th and 15th Amendment and elected 3 United States senators, 1 for the full term and 2 for unexpired terms. For the full term, Alcorn was chosen, and for one unexpired term, General Ames, while Hiram R. Revels, a person of color minister, was chosen to fill an unexpired term of Jefferson Davis. Reveals came from North Carolina that and was educated in Indiana. Oh my gosh. He was a minister in Baltimore at the opening of the war, and there helped to organize two people of color regiments. He came south with the Freedmen's Bureau and was surprised when selected to represent the state in the Senate. He was a man of intelligence, but the Republican United States debated 3 days on his credentials. Finally, after one of Sumner's ableist speeches, not ableism, he was omitted. Even after that, Philadelphia refused to use her Academy of Music for the meeting at which he was to speak. Ames now turned over the government to Alcorn and went to the Senate. Alcorn took a firm and advanced stand. In his inaugural speech, he spoke of his attachment to Mississippi. He declared that it was the duty of the government to protect all its citizens, white and black, before the ballot box, the jury box, and public office, and to give industrial opportunities to the honest and competent without discrimination of color. He said, in the face of the memories that might have separated them from me as a wronged from the wrongers, they offered me their confidence, offered me their guardianship, and their new and precious hopes, with a trustfulness whose very mention stirs my nerves with emotion. I respond in response to the touching irradiance, the most profound anxiety with which I enter my office as governor of this state is that to make the man of color the equal before the law of every other man, the equal not in dead letter, but in living facts. He had a word to say about poor whites. Thousands of our worthy white friends have ever remained to the great extent strangers to the helping hand of the state. I just don't like it how these state officials think that everybody's beneath them, that they've been risen up to a position of power instead of being in civil service of him. Unfortunately, Alcorn, instead of staying and finishing his job, thus well outlined, had universal Southern ambition of the day to go to the United States Senate. He was therefore in office only a little over a year when he went to Washington to succeed Revels. That's the person's name. The legislator, meantime, went to work to set up the government. And tired of all this hair. And get off me. And the part which black people played in this Reconstruction was extraordinary, as it was unexpected. There were far fewer black people of education and ability in Mississippi than in South Carolina or Louisiana, but there were a few, perhaps a bare half dozen, who gave universal and epic making service. One of these leaders, and perhaps the best, tells of the task before them. And here's this person. Oh my gosh. Okay. The new administration, I don't know why someone's getting muted. Oh, never mind. The new administration had an important and difficult task before it. The state government, I know why now. The state government had to be organized from the top to bottom. The new judiciary had to be inaugurated, consisting of 3 justices of the state Supreme Court, 15 judges of the circuit court, 23 chicanery court judges, who had all to be appointed by the governor with the consent of the Senate. And in addition, a new public school system had to be established. There was not a public school building anywhere in the state except in a few of the largest towns, and they, with possible a few exceptions, were greatly in need of repair. To erect the necessary schoolhouses and to reconstruct and repair those already in existence is as to afford educational facilities for both races was by no means an easy task. It necessitated a very large outlay of cash in the beginning, which resulted in a material increase in rates of taxation for a time being. But the Constitution called for the establishment of the system, and of course, the work had to be done. It was not only done, but it was done credibly and as economically as possible, considering the conditions at that time. The system, though slightly changed, still stands, a credible monument to the first Republican state administration that was organized in the state of Mississippi under the Reconstruction Act of Congress. It was also necessary to reorganize, reconstruct, and in many instances rebuild some of the penal and charitable institutions of the state. A new code of laws also had to be adopted to take place of the old code and thus wipe out the black laws, and had been passed by what was known as the Johnson legislature, and in addition bring about other changes so as to make the laws and statutes of the state conform with the new order of things. This was no easy task in view of the fact that a heavy increase in the rate of taxation was thus made necessary for a time being at least. That this important task is splendidly, credibly, and economically done, no fair-minded person who is familiar with the facts will question or dispute. That the state never had before and has never since had a finer judiciary than that which was organized under the administration of Governor Alcorn, and which continued under the administration of Governor Ames, is an indisputable and uncontrovertible fact. When Alcorn administration took charge of the state government, the war had just come to a close. Everything was in a prostrated condition. There had been great depreciations in the value of real of real and personal property. The credit of the state was not very good. The rate of interest for borrowing money was high. To materially increase the bonded debt of the state was not deemed wise. Yet some had to be raised in that way. To raise the balance of higher rate of taxation had to be imposed, since the assessed valuation of taxable property was so low. Jesus. Taxes, tax everything. This is nothing but capital, just reproduction of capital over and over again. God. This is good history though, to learn like how everything came to be, you know what I mean? But fuck. The legislature of 1871 was a session about 6 months and passed 225 acts and resolutions. The increase of citizenship, the revolution through which the state had passed, called about debts and more laws. The expenses of the legislative department were largely the session long. Yet it can hardly be said, considering the work done and the depreciated value of currency, and it was an extravagant assembly. The legislation of 1872 had John R. Lynch, a black person, as Speaker of the House. There were 28 whites and 38 people of color Republicans and 49 Democrats, and it took a trip of Senator Alcor from Washington to induce enough white Republicans to support Lynch in order to elect him. At the close of the session, however, Lynch was presented with a gold watch and chain on the motion of a prominent white Democrat. A resolution was adopted thanking him, quote, for his dignity, impartiality, and courtesy as a presiding officer. The cordon declared his bearing in office had been so proper, his rule in such marked contrast to a former conduct of a notable whites of his party, who had been aspiring to be leaders of black people, that the conservative cheerfully joined in the testimonies. Civil rights measures constituted what time is it? Ooh, I didn't know that. Let me look. Can somebody remind 149? I'm gonna go ahead and do that. 441. Oh my God, I can't do numbers today. Jesus. 494. 491. There we go. Finally got it. Nope. You did 49. Don't do that, Lynn. You're gonna ruin my... Oh my God, we don't have any stoppages at all. Yeah, we're just gonna... Let me look at this. I didn't realize the time. I was having too much fun. Oh my gosh, I just ruined my thing. Hold on. There we go. Bookmarks. There we go. Let me see here. The legislator... Wait. Okay, Clarion declared. Okay. Civil rights measures constitute a considerable part of the legislation between... Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. I got into the book and like... It's a lot of fucking government things, and it's a lot of Reconstruction, and a lot of people going against the Reconstruction, and black people taking the sides of white people sometimes, and mostly black people taking, being like disenfranchised on nonstop and stuff like that. So I don't know, but we'll stop there. Anybody want to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to say real quickly, on something that you said, how you don't like that when it comes to people in government acting like, how they're acting like they're the heads of something rather than, someone who's supposed to do the job of the citizens. Like, that whole thing, that's a myth. they aren't meant to be representative of the citizens. They're meant to represent capital. And here they are showing like capitalist relations when it comes to black people, and it makes it very clear that within electoral politics, not much can be done, and definitely not enough.
You can kind of see how they're setting up for capital and how they're going to make capital even more like I think in the North it's more set up that way, but you can see the beginning of this, right? The opportunity, if we knew about it, to change this whole country into like a non-capitalist country, but that didn't happen. Of course it didn't happen, but you could see how they're bringing capital and all these things into the dominant position of government. That government only represents capital and people that own capital and people that have property, because they keep talking about like how people that are non-property are not allowed to vote. That just gives you the indication that they are, like you said, they're representing capital, because they only want people to be able to govern and to engage as long as they had capital themselves. So that you can see how the United States is transforming into more of this, what we have now. It feels like you could see kind of the embryonic stages of it right there too, after the Civil War, because it is Reconstruction, you know. So, yeah. Don't worry, Joe. I'll come in. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no. I was just gonna ask. Maybe. Do you think maybe you could go to Joe so that way he has some words to put in?
Depends. Does Joe want that?
If Joe's okay with that.
Sure. Okay. Oh.
So what I wanted to say, and they can hear me clearly because I can hear myself, is that Mississippi hasn't changed. Neither has most of the South, but Mississippi really has not changed in their treatment of people of color and black people especially.
Is that it?
That's it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would say yes, because even in the Tennessee, you see there's two black men who are part of their governmental form and stuff. They continuously get racism from like the House of Representatives, the person that like delegates those things. You can see that, and you can see that, like seeing that presently, and then in going back to like reading this, you can see the roots and the behavior and the traditions and the culture as such forming to what it is now, because now you have now you still have this racist shit that's still going on with inside these government systems, of course, you know. No. All right, does anybody else have anything to say before I close it?
Not me. Other than much love and take care.
All right, everybody. We'll read this. We'll go back to this tomorrow. We're getting there. It's a long, dense thing. Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. I hope people understood it. If not, you could always